Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's training on advocacy in an election year, staying nonpartisan while taking real action. My name is Kalina Myerchuk, pronouns she, her, and I'm AAUW's advocacy manager. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. Today's recording and slides will be shared with everyone who has registered for this event. We will stop the recording for the Q&A portion following our speaker's presentation and anticipate today's session will go over an hour, no more than an hour and a half, to allow for robust questions. You can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have staff members from Alliance for Justice and AAUW on the line who will be responding in the Q&A box as questions come in, and then we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. If you need technical assistance, please use the chat box. AAUW's Issues First nonpartisan approach means we work with people and elected officials across the political spectrum to build power together and advance equity for women and girls. I'm excited to welcome our expert speaker from the Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy Program, Susan Finkel-Sorless, who will walk us through how we can advocate and engage in an election year while staying nonpartisan. Susan serves as senior counsel for affiliate organizations with Boulder Advocacy. In her role, she provides legal guidance on advocacy and political programs to nonprofit organizations. Susan also advises AFJ and AFJ Action Campaign on legal issues. Prior to joining Alliance for Justice, Susan served as CFO and in-house counsel for America Votes. And prior to that, she was the compliance manager at Emily's List. She has more than a decade of experience with nonprofit advocacy and campaign finance regulations at the federal and state level. So I know we're in good hands today. With that, I'll turn things over to Susan to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just take one moment and share my screen. Thank you so much. I hope everybody can see my screen. Yep, it looks like it. Thank you for inviting me here today. Again, my name is Susan Finkel-Sorless, and I'm with the Boulder Advocacy Group at Alliance for Justice. I'm also here with my colleague, Natalie Ossenforth, and she will be manning the Q&A chat, the Q&A function here on Zoom. And so she can answer all your questions. If you have any questions about my presentation during today. And today we are going to learn how to advocate and educate and take action during an election year, especially staying nonpartisan, being able to do that advocacy in an election year without engaging in a partisan activity. And so we're going to talk about what does it mean when we say nonpartisan? How do you stay nonpartisan? And again, if at any time during this presentation you have any questions, please just put it in the Q&A function and Natalie will answer your question. And after today's presentation, we will be providing these slides and other relevant materials, guidelines that take a deeper dive into each topic. And so you will receive that after this presentation. So, before we get started, I just want to do a couple of our own housekeeping items. I want to tell you about my organization, Alliance for Justice. Alliance for Justice, we are an association of 150 organizations that share a commitment to an equitable, just, and free society. And we build the strength of progressive movements through trainings and education. And it's not just Boulder Advocacy, my group, and Natalie, where we work. It is our courts team. And on the other side of the virtual office aisle, our courts team who serves on the federal bench, as well as educating the public the importance of state elections. Now, Natalie and I work for the Boulder Advocacy Group, and we equip nonprofits with the tools and best practices that you need to engage in a bold, effective advocacy. We want you to be in compliance with your tax status and make sure that you know the regulations and compliance when it comes to advocacy and elections. And we also provide technical source and guidance. And we also have a really cool podcast. And so check that out. Lastly, before we start, I just need to, all attorneys need a disclaimer. Here's mine. Although my colleagues and I are attorneys, we're not your attorneys, and this is not legal advice. This presentation is for educational or for informational purposes only. So, with that, let's get started. So, today's agenda. In today's agenda, we are going to start out by looking at uh, tax exempt organizations. What do we mean about a tax? What do I mean when I say an organization is tax exempt? What do we mean when somebody is a 501c3 or a 501c4? What is that difference? How are their activities affected by their tax exempt status? And from what we're going to do is we are going to look at this first and foremost from the IRS regulations. That's where we're going to start. Now, there may be some there's state and local regulations that your organization will also have to be aware of. We're not going to go into those today, but please be aware. We're going to stick with the IRS today. Then we're going to look at what defines nonpartisan activity. What do I mean by nonpartisan versus partisan activity or partisan communication? And we're going to then apply those and look at how they apply to different activities. First, your issue advocacy, lobbying, talking to ed office holders, educating the public around the issues during an election year. Just because it's an election year, a legislative session is still in session and they're still trying to pass a bill or law, as well as the election. So, how does that affect that advocacy work? Then we're going to discuss engaging in different types of election activity and how to conduct activities in a nonpartisan manner. Finally, we're going to do some best practices and key takeaways, but we're also going to talk about you as an individual. We're going to touch on what the rights you still have as an individual outside of your organization to engage in election activities. So it's always a good start to start with the basic overview of the different tax exempt organizations that are out there that you see engaging in advocacy and election activities, whether it's on social media or in the, on television or whatever. Let's look at the different types of tax exempt organizations that are out there. So we first have 501c3 public charities. Examples of those are like Alliance for Justice, my organization, and AAUW. We are 501c3 public charities. We get a very favorable tax status. We are tax exempt, meaning that we do not pay taxes on any contributions or donations that we get for our organization. We don't have to pay income tax on that. We are also maybe able to provide a tax deduction to our donors. Our donors may be able to take a tax deduction on their contribution to our organizations. Again, tax exempt, tax deductible, that is a very favorable tax treatment. But because of that, there is a trade-off on the types of activities that we can do. Lobbying activities, lobbying is something that a 501c3 public charity can engage in, but it is limited. It is capped. There is only a certain amount of lobbying that you can do. And we do have guidebooks on how you can determine how much your C3 lobbying you can do, but so you're limited in the amount of lobbying you can do. Electoral activities. Although you can engage in nonpartisan electoral activities, you cannot support or oppose candidates. You cannot engage in partisan support. Now, let's compare that to 501c4s, those social welfare organizations. I could also be talking about 501c5s, which are labor unions, or 501(c)(6)s, which are membership organizations like a bar association or a chamber of commerce. In today's presentation, I'm just going to lump them all together and call them 501(c)(4) social welfare organizations. So, social welfare organizations, C4s, we have Alliance for Justice Action. We are an affiliated organization with Alliance for Justice. We also have, AAUW Action Fund. That's your 501(c)(4). We C4s are tax exempt. But because they do not provide that tax deductibility to those contributions, there is the trade-off is that we can do more activity. We can do different types of activity. For example, lobbying. Lobbying is unlimited. We are not limited to the amount of lobbying that we can do. And as a secondary activity, we can support or oppose candidates. A C4 could, if it chose to, could do partisan political activity. Now, also out there on social media, especially because it is an election year, we're going to see all sorts of posts on social media from 527 political orgs. 527s are what the IRS calls all those campaign committees, whether it's a candidate campaign, a political action committee, a political party. They are the 527s. We're really not going to touch on them today, but it's good to know that they are out there. 527s are political orgs that are tax exempt. They usually do not do any lobbying activities. That's usually not something that they are, by their very different definitions, something that they do. So if they do, it's usually taxable. But usually their sole activity is to get out the vote for their candidates. And so they are partisan campaigns. So I have a next couple of slides that are going to illustrate the previous slide, but I'm going to introduce traffic lights, the idea of traffic lights. We all know what traffic lights are. We have our green, yellow, and red. And unfortunately, if everything about compliance and advocacy was a green light or a red light, this would be pretty easy. But unfortunately, we have a lot of yellow lights out there, especially when it comes to elections and what is nonpartisan activity. So think about this. Do you stop at yellow lights or do you go through yellow lights? And hopefully today we go through something where you can determine when we're talking about nonpartisan election activity or nonpartisan advocacy, what is the safest yellow light you can? So, of course, we have our partisan political activity for C3 is an absolute red light. That is, supporting or opposing candidates for public office is a no-go for C3s. Lobbying, we give that a yellow light because it is permitted, but you need to ensure that you're staying with your IRS limits. You want to keep good records. You want to track your time. And you may want to consider you're probably under the 501(h) election, but lobbying is lobbying is defined as a specific activity. And then, of course, we give a green light to all of those non-lobbying advocacy, uh, educating legislators, training advocates, organizing communities, nonpartisan voter outreach, engaging in litigation, all of this. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of other non-lobbying advocacy that as 501(c)(3) public charity can do. That's an absolute green light. And then, of course, when we look at advocacy for 501(c)(4) social welfare organizations, we give a green light to social welfare. Anything a 501(c)(3) can do is primary purpose, social welfare purpose that a C4 can do, including unlimited lobbying, nonpartisan election activities, educating legislators, training advocates, organizing communities, engaging in litigation. Again, lots of things that the organization can do under the social welfare banner, and it is unlimited. A C3 could also engage in partisan political activity if it so choose. I believe that your organization does engage in nonpartisan activities, and that's great. But you do not engage in partisan political activities. And so that's why we're here today, is to make sure that you understand the difference between something that's partisan or political. So that's one of our goals. So that we give a yellow light because it is permitted, but there's a limit. And if you do engage in partisan political activities, you could be have to report or register as a PAC in a state or a at the federal or state level. So why are we talking about this today? Why is compliance important? Well, it's important because if you're a 501c3, remember your tax status. You must abide by your tax status. And as a C, if you're a C3 engaging in partisan activity, the IRS could revoke your tax status. If you're a C4, the IRS could impose a tax if you go over the limit of if you do more partisan political activity than you are allowed to do. There's also always the cost of responding to investigations and complaints. It is time consuming. So being able to show that you've been compliant, knowing how to comply with that tax status is very important. And there's also the reputation amongst your funders and your community members, the people that you serve. Being able to uh, be compliant is very important just for the health of your organization. So let's talk. I'm going to talk briefly about risk assessment and whether or not you're a C3 or a C4. Each organization needs to establish its tolerance for risk because we talked about red lights and green lights. But most important is those yellow lights. And you need to weigh in on the risk to decide whether to stop when the light turns yellow or whether or not it is safe to go through. And this is especially important when you're talking about nonpartisan advocacy activities or nonpartisan voter outreach. When doing this during an election year, some activity that may be considered safe um, in an off year in 2025 may be high risk in October of 2026. So you really need to establish the organization's risk tolerance level, which I'm sure your organization have. So when you're undertaking an activity that may be risky, let's say there's something about Title IX or changing Title IX or a call to revoke Title IX. The org may determine that this is something that you need to speak about. So this is our issue. We are going to advocate against the revocation of Title IX. It's really important to us. It is worth the risk. But we are going to we're going to continue with that activity, but we are going to modify the risk. We're going to take a medium risk. So we're going to change some of the language that we're using. Or you may determine that this is not a topic that you are part of the mission. So there's another important issue that's out there, but it's not part of your core mission. So you're going to decide we cannot take the risk, so therefore we're going to forego this activity. So that's a lot about your tax status and how you need to start thinking about it. So now let's talk about nonpartisan. When we say something's nonpartisan, what exactly does that mean? So, under the IRS definition, nonpartisan means that you are not supporting or opposing any candidates for public office, and that's either directly supporting or indirectly supporting. Uh, you know, it's partisan if you say vote for Mary, or if you conduct activities that will lead the voters to support Mary, even if you're not explicitly saying to do so. So, nonpartisan is when you are supporting or opposing candidates or you're conducting activity that lends indirectly support for candidates. So Who's a candidate? So, candidates are those running for public office. They could be from a major party, or they could be, either Dem or Republican, or from a smaller party like a Green Party or an independent party. And it's all the way up from, from the top of the ticket from the president all the way down to a local school board or city council. If they are on a ballot, then they are a candidate. And these include those who are running for specific offices, whether it's a specific office or those running for nonpartisan offices. So they're the president. If somebody is running for president, then that is a partisan office. There is a party associated with the candidate that is running for that office, or governor or senate. But sometimes lower offices are what's known as nonpartisan offices, like school board or sometimes judges for state courts. But they still are candidates. And that's what makes any support, even for those nonpartisan offices, partisan. Also, there is such a thing called when you have someone who hasn't necessarily declared that they are running, but there is a groundswell out there to get them to run, like Oprah for president, or Kanye or Dwayne The Rock Johnson. They want them to run for president, and there's a groundswell to get them on the ballot or themselves to declare as a candidate. Um, Here in DC, in the District of Columbia, Eleanor Holmes Norton, our long-time representative, has declared that she is not running for re-election. So now that seat is open. And there could be a lot of groundswell to get others to run for that seat, to run for DC rep. Um, any support for those for or any support for that or for those potential candidates would be considered partisan. So, also, what is public office? It's a candidate that's running for public office. It's an office that's created by statute. It's an ongoing position. There's a fixed term. They have to run for reelection. It requires an oath of office. And, this can include school boards or city councils. But it is different when it is not somebody that is when you see it at the federal level when someone is nominated for a position, and then their nomination is voted on by the legislator. That is they're not considered candidates. It needs to be someone that is needs to run for re-election and that the public is going to vote for them. So let's now turn ourselves, now that we know who's a candidate, what type of candidates are, let's look at what's known as the facts and circumstances test. So what counts as nonpartisan? Remember, I started out talking about risk and weighing the risk. The non-facts and circumstances test, you need to weigh the different factors surrounding the communication. It's a spectrum of whether or not something's low risk or high risk or somewhere in the middle. The organization really should consider the activity, the communication as a whole, and consider what is the purpose of the communication? Why are you talking now? What is out there that you need to speak about? Who is the intended audience that you want to listen? And then why are you communicating now? What is the timing about that? What is the timing? Is there a legislative vote, or is it because it's the election? So the facts and circumstances test, this is something that the IRS has given us. These are the factors that the IRS is going to look at to determine whether or not a communication or an activity is nonpartisan or partisan. So these are the nonpartisan factors. First, there's no reference to a candidate or an election. You're not talking about candidates. There's an external factor driving the timing. There has been, an unfortunate natural disaster. there something has happened outside of the organization that's not the election that you need to respond to. It's you're talking to a community, a sector of the community unrelated to a candidate's election. And you're talking about the organization's core issues. You have a history of these issues, of backing these issues, about talking about these issues. Um, Now let's flip that over and let's talk about what would the IRS deem uh, partisan factors. One, you're referring to a candidate, not an elected official. You're referring to them as a candidate. Your timing is motivated by the election, and that's pretty important. You're targeting a specific community to influence a candidate's election. Again, you don't have to say vote for Mary, but if you are targeting a specific community with a get out the vote message, um, because you think those are the people that will vote for Mary, that is partisan. Whenever you compare the candidates position on an issue to the organization's uh, preferred position on that issue, if you're asking the candidates to take a pledge and support your issues, something like that would be considered partisan. And lastly, there is something called a wedge issue. And wedge issues are something that is dividing the candidates and party. There is definitely a position that a candidate is taking, and the opposite candidate is taking a different position. And when you're using that issue in your GOTV or in your election activity, then you are creating a partisan activity. Now, unfortunately, the IRS has only given one example, and the example is choice or abortion. That's what the IRS uses as an example. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be another issue. It just needs to be an issue that two organizations are fighting against. For example, if there's a pipeline, and one is pro pipeline and pro oil and gas, and another candidate is against the pipeline, if you say, hey, remember, vote against oil and gas or the oil and gas industry, then you are essentially using a wedge issue to show your support for one candidate over the other without even saying the candidate's name. We will get into uh, different examples of the facts and circumstances test and how you can, change the factors in order to make something that might be partisan into something that's nonpartisan. Lastly, because we are in an election year, because 2026 has started, we need to remember that timing and context is very important. Sometimes communications are going to become riskier for a C3 or more partisan, uh, the closer you are to an election. If you are deciding to communicate just because the election is coming up, and then your perfectly fine, nonpartisan activity that you did in October of 2025 could become very partisan in October of 2026. So keep timing in mind, especially since we are in an election year this year. Unless, of course, you were in Virginia last year, but that's something else. So let's talk about how we can look at the facts and circumstances test and engage in issue advocacy, continuing our lobbying, continuing our advocacy work, and ensuring that it stays nonpartisan. And I'm going to go over some best practices. And I'm just a warning that you will probably hear me repeat myself over and over again, that you need to be careful, ensure that you are talking about the policy issues and that you are referring to elected officials as officials. So these best practices, I may be repeating myself over and over in the different examples. So first, let's talk about issue advocacy. You basically remember, do not refer to the politicians as candidates or reference their election. When you're lobbying, when you're doing your grassroots advocacy or engaging in other issue advocacy, you are going to refer to that. You can refer to them in their elected official position. You can talk about them as elected officials, as legislators, as a member of the House. You want to ensure that you are focusing on your policy recommendations. It's about the policy. It is about the issue. It is not about people serving or being able to serve, or should they even be in office. It's not about that. And you want to be aware of perceptions when you're commenting on contentious issues, because remember, there are those wedge issues. And so this is how, stick with these best practices when you're engaging in issue advocacy. And one thing, by the way, just want to say from the outset that bolder advocacy, we want you to be bold in your advocacy. We want you to continue speaking, advocating, lobbying, educating the public about the issues. You do not cede the microphone because it's an election year. Just follow the best practices to keep things nonpartisan. You can absolutely keep lobbying. If legislators are still in session, keep working with them, keep lobbying them. Make sure that you are referring to office holders in their official capacity, not as candidates, even if they're up for reelection. You want to time all of your activity with the legislative actions. If there was a good vote that was taken in March of 2026 and you want to highlight that, you want to educate the public that, hey, guess what? This bill just passed, and we are thankful for the legislators that stood up and voted yes. You can do that in March of 2026. Do not wait until October of 2026 to then say, hey, guess what? This great bill was passed back in March, and we want to thank these legislators for doing that. That you are then, again, remember timing. It's very important. You also want to be aware of any perceptions when commenting on contentious issues, of course. You can criticize incumbents. You can criticize incumbent office holders. Again, focus on public policy issues, their official actions, their job as a legislator. You do not want to criticize to influence the election. You don't want to criticize their personal characteristics. You want to talk about what they did and that about the policy issue. You don't want to question whether or not they should be in the office in the first place. And again, time your communications with specific policy issues. Accountability. So we have this phrase, there's this phrase called thanks and spanks. This is when you are holding accountable office holders for their votes. And if you want to do this, especially during an election year, you want to include all the policy makers involved. If 10 senators voted against the bill, and you want to admonish those that voted against that bill, admonish all of them that voted against it, not just those who are up for reelection. Don't just highlight, oh, here are the 10 senators, but I'm going to pick out this senator to admonish because they're up for reelection. You need to thank everyone who took that great vote, whether or not they're up for reelection, or admonish those for that bad vote. Again, you are talking about them in their elected official capacity. You're focusing on their official action of that legislative vote. You want to have a track record of working on those issues, and you are timing it with the vote, with the legislative vote, not saving it up for right before the election happens. Now, let's say that a candidate said something, or an elected official was speaking in their capacity as a candidate, either on the trail or in it. at a debate, something that's said that needs to be corrected. You can fact check candidates. Something like this might be safer for a C3 or safer for a 501(c)(4) to do. Um, Now, fact checking you can do this, but it cannot serve as a proxy to support or oppose the candidate. When you're responding, you don't just want to correct the facts. You don't want to admonish the person that said them. You want to make sure that you are very careful of how it's presented. And if you want to correct the record if an impermissible statement is made, in the heat of the moment, you want to issue a disclaimer and correct yourself if you make an impermissible statement. So here's what I'm saying. Here's an opportunity of how to do this. So when you want to fact check your candidate. So candidate Bob, whether or not they're an elected official capacity, they're an elected official in their day job, on the trail, that candidate Bob said, snap, people in poverty need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Now, there are two ways to respond to candidate Bob in this ridiculous statement. There's the partisan response and a nonpartisan response. So a partisan response would be something like candidate Bob is cold-hearted guy. If elected, he will only serve his billionaire friends. Here we're talking about candidate Bob. We're giving we're talking about his personal characteristics, that he's cold-hearted, that if he is elected, he will only serve his billionaire friends. So we're talking about him in his elected in a capacity as a candidate, and that we are not encouraging people to vote for him. So we've said a partisan response. Now, let's compare that with a nonpartisan response, maybe something like, hey, you take the opportunity to educate the public. Pulling up your own bootstraps is a myth. Here's the facts. So we haven't stayed quiet. We're not ceding the microphone on this issue. We are just not going to talk about candidate Bob. We are going to take the opportunity of what was said to educate the public on the issue. And we don't even have to say that candidate Bob said something terrible that we don't like. We are correcting the record without referencing the candidate. So something like that really dials down the risk. It dials down a partisan response into something that becomes more partisan. Another thing that under advocacy that could C3s and C4s do is that they could do legislative scorecards. Here's the best way to keep them nonpartisan or lower the risk is for legislative scorecards. There are two ways. One, if you are sending it to the public, if you are broadcasting it, publishing it regularly, you put this on your website like you've done. This would be considered nonpartisan. You are including all legislators. You include a broad range of issues. Sometimes with smaller groups, it's sometimes smaller organizations get together and they will create a joint voting record because then they can cover more issues. You also want to necessarily avoid commentary, just the votes that were taken, and not necessarily comment on whether or not they were good or bad, or whether or not, again, whether or not that elected official should be back in office. Now, if you send it to members, if it's just to your membership, as long as you're publishing regularly, you including all legislators, you could just do a narrow range of issues, and you could comment on the votes, whether or not the vote was good. The official action is something that was good or bad, not commenting on whether or not they are fit for office. Now, everything that we've been talking about today, you know, rules that apply to verbal and print communications also include to online communications. And of course, there are all sorts of social media platforms. I can't keep up with them, honestly. They change a lot. Some that are out there today may not be out there in a few years. But we want to talk specifically, just quickly, about specifically issues surrounding social media. So, retweets, shares, likes, linking. Your organization, your nonprofit, can only share what it could have written originally. So a 501(c)(3) has to remain nonpartisan. A C4 staying nonpartisan can only share nonpartisan activity. You are responsible for what the content that you link to. The IRS will look at it as if your organization said it itself. It may be possible to link to candidates, but you only want to link to candidates in a nonpartisan way, not to critique. And in fact, I think that you should link to elected officials versus their candidate campaigns is safer. Um, and you don't want to like partisan content. If you like or repost partisan content, you yourself, your organization yourself, has engaged in partisan activity. So again, on social media, it is fine to follow candidates, but you need to follow all candidates and have a nonpartisan reason to do so. I think but it's perfectly fine to follow their official as an elected official. Here, it would be higher risk to follow Raphael Warnock's candidate campaign versus safer, less risk to follow his official uh, Senate social media account. So now that we've talked about issue advocacy, let's talk about election activities. And again, these best practices, you'll probably hear me repeat myself even more. So, nonpartisan activities. When we're talking about nonpartisan activities, usually we're talking about ballot measure work, candidate engagement, voter education, voter registration, or get out the vote, what we call shorthand GOTV. Partisan activities usually are something like endorsements, when we use partisan targeting, candidate scorecards, using wedge issues to get out the vote. And so we're going to go through different examples of this and apply the facts and circumstances again to these different activities. So here we have an example, quick example of primary purpose versus partisan purpose. Um, one on the left-hand side, or the purple, League of Women Voters of Ohio. Here's a primary purpose, a nonpartisan uh, election information, has information of when you need to register, when you need to return in your absentee ballot, when is election day. All that information is on there. That's primary purpose for a C4, nonpartisan election outreach. And of course, then on our right, we have a very partisan political message. Vote blue no matter who in 2022. Of course, that again doesn't state anything about a candidate, but it is definitely telling you what type of candidate to vote for and what party to vote for. So that's pretty partisan. So let's talk about ballot measures. Ballot measures are lobbying. They're considered lobbying. And even though they are on the ballot and it is part of the election, ballot measure work is not partisan campaign intervention, okay, on its surface. And so it is considered lobbying, and it should be tracked against your lobbying limits if you're a C3. But you also need to, not only are you following the IRS rules about how much lobbying you can do, but because ballot measures are on the ballot, usually you will have to follow the state election and campaign finance laws. Usually there are reporting requirements if you engage in ballot measures at the state level or also at the local level. So things that would be considered nonpartisan ballot measure work are when you were circulating those petitions, when you were endorsing the measures, vote for measure 5, endorsing measures, telling people to vote on how to vote on the ballot measure is perfectly fine. It's lobbying. You can also register voters using the importance of voting for that ballot measure. Now, some things that would be considered partisan would be when you align the organization's position with the candidate or political party. And here we have, every year ballot measures are out there in lots of states. Some ballot measures become very popular, or the yes or no campaign becomes very popular. And a candidate may want to align itself with the ballot, with that ballot measure, and say, hey, I'm voting yes on 4. You should too. If a candidate says that, that's fine. You're not aligning yourself with that candidate's position. You're not using that candidate's position to increase popularity or your own nonpartisan work. So keep your nonpartisan work separate. You also don't want to target your outreach on how voters will vote for a candidate versus voting for the ballot measure. Another thing that you can do as nonpartisan is you can do nonpartisan candidate education. This is when you have created materials, you have research that you have already gathered about your organization, about the community that you serve, about the issues that you feel are important. If you have created this research that you've used in other arenas, then you can share that with candidates as long as you are sharing it with all candidates. You are not creating any new information, because that could, you really need to have something that you've used independently that you are now offering to candidates. There's also candidate questionnaires. And this is when you are out there, you're gathering information where candidates stand on the issues so that you can educate your members, or you can educate the public about where the candidate stands. You want to be very careful, and to make sure that this is nonpartisan, you are going to use unbiased questions, open-ended questions. None of the questions shouldn't have a yes or no answer, or the question cannot hint at a proper answer. You want to distribute to all candidates. You want to make sure you have a broad range of issues, and you're not asking for a pledge. And as well as that, you are not editing down any responses to make it more palatable or to make it not so palatable. You're presenting those responses equally. And you may also want to use a disclaimer. And something like that, what we mean is when you want to tell the audience, the voter, that you are not endorsing any of these candidates. This is not an endorsement. This is just for your informational purposes only. Candidate questionnaires are something when the voter, the reader, reads it, it is going to make up their own mind. You are not slanting anything to tell the voter how they should think about any of these candidates. That's the goal of candidate questionnaires. Now, there is something called candidate scorecards. You see a lot of these for C4s or 527s. Candidate scorecards are a partisan activity. I'm sure that you can see the difference between what I just showed you as a candidate questionnaire and educating the public where the candidates stand so they can make up their own mind. Here, we are definitely, this organization is definitely telling the voter how they feel and how they should vote with this champ and chump chart. So you can also, as a C3 or C4, conduct nonpartisan debates and forums. Again, you're having unbiased questions. There's a broad range of issues. You invite all viable candidates. There's an impartial moderator. You have an unbiased audience. There's no contextual favoritism. You don't allow one candidate to grab the microphone and start working their way through the audience and shaking hands unless you allow everyone to do that. Everyone stays on the dais. So that's a candidate debate and forum. Also, there are such things as when you want a candidate or an elected official, a big ticket item, to come to your fundraiser. And so these are appearances unrelated to the candidacy, but they still may be a candidate. Again, timing is important. You want to make sure the closer to the election, the higher risk this will become. But this is when you invite a elected official because they're the governor and you want to give them an award or a policy update. There's no equal opportunity required. You don't have to invite their opposition, but you make sure that they avoid mentioning their candidacy. You're not timing the event with the election, and you use disclaimers. And what we mean by that is on the invitation, in the letter to the candidate, everybody is well aware that this is not a partisan political event. This is not a campaign event. This is a policy dinner. This is a awards dinner. It is not about the candidate. And humans are human, and people make mistakes. And here's an example of when a disclaimer should happen or an impermissible statement is made, such as the candidate um, you know, in their zeal talking about the policy and how great your organization is and how great the audience is and the progress that's been made and the progress that needs to happen. They say, and that's why you need to vote for me again, or that's why I need to return to office, or that's why you need to vote for this party, or we need to flip the house, or whatever. They say something that's political. The next person up on the dais, hopefully, is a member of the organization, and they say, thank you, kind uh, Representative Jane. Just a reminder to our audience, this is a nonpartisan event. We do not endorse candidates. Thank you. So you zip it up right away. Here's some examples. I always say it's best to have a disclaimer in your back pocket. The Alliance for Justice does not support or oppose candidates or political parties. Nonprofit X and its partners do not support or oppose candidates or political parties. This voter guide is being shared for educational purposes only. This is just like make sure that you use disclaimers, but then you also abide by those disclaimers, not just use them, live them. So here's some, now that we've talked about how you deal with candidates, you educate candidates, you allow them to come to a forum. Here's now let's talk about how you're going to talk to voters. And this is my last part of the presentation, or one of my last part of the presentation. And then we'll wrap it up, and then we're going to open it up for questions soon. So first thing, your organization wants to create social media posts about voter education. And voter education is about information about the voting process. Here we have an example, voter facts. What should I know before I register to vote? What should I know about voting in person? What should I know about voting um, by mail? Here we are, we're talking to the general public. We're doing nonpartisan targeting. There's no candidate or party mentioned. This information is only about the voting process. It is a good example of a nonpartisan get out the vote document. Here's another example, encouraging eligible voters to vote. Your voice, your vote. Happy election day. Um, Making sure that people are want to vote, ginning up support to get people to engage into civic engagement. You're encouraging all eligible voters to vote. There's no bias against or for a candidate. It's not coordinating with the party or candidate. and you're targeting for a nonpartisan reason. We'll get to that right away. But here we have your voice is your vote. This is not an issue. This is not a wedge issue. We're not saying your vote on choice is your voice. Something like that, you would be politicizing the vote process. And we'll get into that in just a few moments. But your voice, your vote is a good nonpartisan way to encourage people to engage in civic engagement. So I've been talking about targeting, and I'm going to go over briefly. Nonpartisan targeting is a way that you can determine who are you going to talk to. C3s may target voters, or C4s may target in a nonpartisan manner when it is your natural constituency. It is people who live in your region your nonprofit operates. The people your nonprofit serves, clients, patients, ethnic community, the people your organization hopes to serve. You can target, you can outreach specifically to them. And also, you can do outreach to historically underrepresented people at the polls. This includes Black voters, young voters, student voters, brand new citizens who are it's going to be the first time that they ever vote because they're a new citizen. If they've been historically underrepresented at the polls, this is where you can target. You want to use geographics targeting versus political targeting. Now, partisan targeting, this is when you are outreaching to voters based on how you think they're likely to vote. Okay. You're going to use party ID. You are going to use issue ID, a wedge issue. Who supports this issue is who we are going to target because we think they're going to come out and vote a certain way. And so there are ideological models out there when you are trying to decide. This is partisan targeting versus nonpartisan targeting. So here we have a couple of examples. Again, your vote is your voice is a low risk, give it a green light, nonpartisan activity. Um, now let's talk. Now I'm going to give you a few more examples and we're going to go on to your individual rights. But we're going to talk about GOTV, the Get Out the Vote campaigns, on whether or not something is partisan because you've used issues or wedge issues. Remember those wedge issues of when they divide a candidate or party in a certain way. This would be partisan. So the first thing I see here is I vote the environment or vote pro-choice. Now, I vote the environment. I would say that's a yellow light, not necessarily a red light. It's not necessarily a wedge issue just on its own. But something like that could become a wedge issue. Voting pro-choice, again, remember the IRS has used pro-choice abortion as a wedge issue, as an example of a wedge issue. And so vote pro-choice would be a partisan activity. So here we have another one. Kermit is fall is in the air and abortion is on the ballot. This would be a political purpose activity. Unless, of course, it's a ballot measure, unless you're doing this with a ballot initiative. And there have been an increased number of ballot measures about abortion and choice on state ballots. So my little quiz again, vote, it's easy, is a green light. We give that a green light. It's low risk. Again, vote the environment. Could be a yellow light, could be a safe yellow light. But of course, voting pro-choice is an absolute red light. Okay, so last thing I'd like to talk to you about is your individual rights. And you as an organization, these rules that we've been talking about apply to 501c3s, apply to nonprofits, 501c4s. your staff, board members, your volunteers, when you are acting on behalf of that organization. It's not when you're acting in your own individual capacity on your own free time. You do not give up your First Amendment rights just because you work for a nonprofit organization. You just want to remember what hat you're wearing. Okay. We like to talk about it in hats. So, as if you're operating as an individual, and you're conducting partisan political activity, you want to make sure that you're not using your organization's resource. You're not doing it on staff time. You're not doing your organization's email. You want to use disclaimers as appropriate. You want to distinguish yourself between you as an individual versus you as an organizational representative. You know, organization name is for identification purposes only. Maybe have that on LinkedIn. You're at a rally. I'm not representing my C3 right now. I'm at this event as a private citizen. And think about every time that you act or you are engaging in the public. Are you engaging in the public as an individual? Are you on that Zoom call as an individual? Or are you on that Zoom call as your organization? On those, even on those Zoom calls, don't have a t-shirt with the candidate's name on it if you're on a organizational Zoom call, or have a yard sign behind your head. Make sure that you keep daylight between your own individual activity and your organizational activity. So let's wrap this up before we start with questions. Let's talk about some key takeaway and resources. These are best practices during an election. In order to stay nonpartisan, focus on the issues. Avoid criticizing or supporting the people running. Talk about the elected official in their capacity as an elected official, and avoid talking about them as a candidate or using personal attributes on whether or not they should be in the office in the first place. So don't miss your issue advocacy with your nonpartisan GOTV or your nonpartisan voter registration. And the closer to the election, remember timing is everything. Avoid identifying candidates by name or image unless you are, of course, doing a nonpartisan voter guide. So C3s, C4s, public charities continue to engage in nonpartisan issue advocacy, lobbying, and voter engagement. Ensure that your activities do not support or oppose candidates running for elected office, especially important for 501c3s. And that is whether you explicitly support them or implicitly support them, whether you are actually saying we endorse Jane for governor versus you do activity that would skew support to Jane for governor. Make sure that you stay nonpartisan. You also remember, track your lobbying, remain within your organization's lobbying limit, keep your personal and organizational activities separate. We have lots of resources online at afj.org. We have our connection, which talks about everything for 501c3s and 501c4s to operate. We also have our Rules of the Game podcast. Natalie and I are often a guest, and we have several guidebooks. We also have ways to get a hold of us if you want to reach out to us with any tech questions. We can provide technical assistance. We cannot provide you legal advice, but we can help you navigate these rules. And so you can reach out to us at advocacy@afj.org at any time with your questions. So with that, I'm going to stop the share and we can open it up for discussion or questions. I have not looked at the chat. Sorry.
Susan, we have a number of questions, some of
Oh,
which are
great.
related to each other and others are a little bit different. So here's the first one.
Kick off. Great. All right. Well, yes, thank you so much again, Susan and Natalie, for the really informative session today. Again, we'll be sharing Susan's slides and the other resources from AFJ along with the recording to everyone who registered today. We're also excited to share a new AAUW resource, which is a nonpartisan playbook for AAUW affiliates and branches. So it affirms our nonpartisan standard and provides examples of how you can engage in advocacy to advance AAUW's mission. And that includes sample language and guidance across a variety of activities. So make sure you have that. You can also visit aaw.org/act for additional resources in our advocacy toolkit and to join the AAUW Action Network to receive action alerts on pressing policy issues. In fact, we just learned earlier today that a public comment period will open tomorrow on the U.S. Department of Education's proposed rules that would change student loan access for graduate and professional degrees. So this is a really critical time to make our voices heard for equity in higher education, and we'll be calling on our members and advocates to submit comments over the next month. So make sure you're signed up to stay in the loop. We also have some great programming coming up next month. So we hope you join us on February 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern to learn more about how you and your branch can promote AAUW education values through school board advocacy. And we'll also look forward to connecting with many of you again for AAUW's winter member gathering on February 18th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. So we hope you're leaving today's session, feeling more empowered and inspired to take action this year as we head into some critical elections. And know that you have resources at your disposal and the AAUW community to support you. You can reach our national team anytime at advocacy@aaw.org. So thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank
Have a
you
good
for
one.
having us.